Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the International Myopia Institute's White Paper Reports Symposium. My name is Earl Smith, and it's my pleasure to be able to moderate the session this morning. And as you can see on the slide, I have several disclosures. I receive research funding from the National Eye Institute, Brian Holden Vision Institute, and from the U of H Foundation. And I have several conflicts of interest that are relevant for subjects within this symposium. There are also disclosures associated with the IMI. The International Myopia Institute is an independent, non-profit entity. It was founded by the Brian Holden Vision Institute. In fact, this was one of Brian's last initiatives that he got started. The IMI is independent of the BHVI. It has its own advisory board, and it has its own committees of experts. The IMI does, however, receive funding from the Brian Holden Vision Institute, from Carl Zeiss Vision, Cooper Vision, SLR, Alcon, and the Vision Impact Institute. The creation of the IMI was motivated by the fact that much of what we know about myopia does not really get communicated outside the scientific community. We discuss myopia extensively in meetings like the Academy, the International Myopia Conference, and things like that. But a lot of those ideas don't get communicated to the broader components of society. And the idea behind the IMI was to create a forum where all interested researchers could discuss and contribute to developing a consensus on issues that are relevant to our current understanding of myopia. The overall goals are to collect evidence regarding the epidemic of myopia, as I said before, to build consensus on issues related to understanding myopia, to accumulate evidence on possible solutions for managing myopia, and again, to educate and advocate to a wide audience outside the scientific community on the adverse effects of myopia and potential programs or regimens to reduce the burden of myopia. Our current specific aim is to bring together key researchers in collaboration with the International Myopia Conference to collect and review evidence and to produce consensus white papers related to myopia that will provide guidance for future research and evidence for policymakers, practitioners, and educators on the management of myopia. The IMI was formed around the key values of scientific integrity, meticulous attention to detail, collaborative, respectful, and acknowledgement of all contributions in the area, and focus on evidence-based knowledge on all issues related to understanding myopia and for reducing the burden of myopia. This illustrates some of who we are. We have an advisory board that consists of 12 optometrists, ophthalmologists, and vision scientists from around the globe. Serge Redchenkov, who headed up the ocular disease section of WHO for many years, is the chair of the advisory board. Monica Zhang, who just had a baby last week, is our executive director, and she's the one that is responsible for taking care of all the details. She wishes she could be here today. We are largely a virtual entity. It is basically centered in Sydney, and this is our website, and I want to draw your attention to the web address and point out the fact that membership in the International Myopia Institute is free. We encourage you to log on and join. More than just joining, we urge you to contribute. We currently have over 360 members associated with the IMI. And this is a brief history. We really got started in the Academy meeting in 2015, and at the ARVO meeting the next year, we actually got together two groups of folks to work on the initial two white papers. And then we thought that was about all we could handle at the time. We were very fortunate because the next spring at the International Myopia Conference in Aston, we were able to develop a collaborative partnership with the IMC, and that allowed us to put together 5 additional white paper committees. And currently, there are over 90 contributors to the 7 white papers that have been reviewed, and they've been harmonized, they've been accepted by investigative ophthalmology and vision science. They are scheduled to be published early next year, late January, early February, and this is our first opportunity to discuss some of the issues that are in those white papers to the broader public. And so this is our schedule for today. We're going to discuss 5 of the papers. The first is the paper defining and classifying myopia. That'll be presented by one of the lead author, Ian Flitcroft from the Dublin Institute of Technology. The next paper will be by Chris Wildeset on interventions for myopia control. The third paper by James Wolfson on clinical trials and instrumentation. Kate Gifford will talk on clinical management and guidelines. And finally, David Troilo will talk about experimental animal models. The 2 other white papers we hope to be able to discuss at an ARVO-SIG, depending on whether or not that's accepted. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and we will have time for questions at the end. So please hold your questions until the end. And so without further delay, it's my pleasure to bring up Ian Flitcroft from the Dublin Institute of Technology to talk about definitions and classifications of myopia.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Yes, it seems to be. I'd like to thank Earl and the whole committee for allowing me to be partake of this whole enterprise, which is, I think, really about timely and valuable activity, and also all the other members of the committee that work with me in this area. Next slide. Now, when I think of the word committee, somewhere in my subconscious, this kind of image always comes up. So the notion that sort of any good idea put into a committee will come out as a camel. And I'm hoping that at the end of this, at least we have a sort of a good-looking pony rather than a camel. So in terms of just, I mean, you all sort of know these points that within the context here, but as well as the growing prevalence and the public health implications which we've been talking about over the last few years, we're now getting to the point where we're having multiple interventions. And the big change is that myopia is now becoming a therapeutic area, which means that industry is coming in, it's starting to actually, patients will be going into treatment programs, and now's the chance for us to keep control of this as practitioners in terms of an evidence base. Now, we've been focused on very much on efficacy. We've been a little bit on safety, but acceptability is another key part of this for both parents and kids. We don't want to make kids' childhoods miserable by making myopia a little bit less. So one question is, are we ready for that kind of therapeutic area or that prime time as an area? Now, the short answer is we're not, and the problem is we've been at this for so long. It's kind of taken us by surprise all of a sudden, the fact that we're close to the point of using these as treatments. So the terminology we've had has been accrued over 400 years since Kepler. We've been talking about myopia. And the current thresholds, some of them, I mean, there are certain statistical questions you might ask about those, and some of them are also, dare I say, imperfect. So in terms of the criteria for good definitions, these be applicable to the question being asked. That means be relevant to biology, need to be valid statistically and scientifically. Has to be useful and applicable for health policy. Now the last two, acceptability and get a high level of consensus, that's where things get more challenging. And going back to my camel analogy, there is no such thing as a perfect definition that will meet all these things, so there's always an element of compromise to be sought. So here's some of the terminology that has been used over the years. What we have here is just, we missed out the word myopia. So in terms of the classifications, we've classified in terms of etiology, age of onset, progression pattern, and the amount. And some of these terms go back several centuries to Donders and before. And the point I'll come back to later on is that some of these terms are in different brackets because particularly words like pathologic or pathological myopia are used to describe both an amount of myopia and the complication of myopia. So there's a logical confusion there, which is quite endemic. So do we need new definitions? Don't we have some good ones? ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization, has just came out of beta this year. The last one, ICD-10, was finalized about, I think, 18 years ago. So we're going to have this definition for a long time. And within, so that's one definition there, which we'll analyze in a second. And the next one is from the World Health Organization report, which was done with the Brian Holden Institute from a meeting in 2015, which again just is a definition in terms of the amount. So to use a term I'll come back to, so this is a qualitative or just descriptive definition, this is a quantitative one. So we have two recent definitions from impeccable sources. Let's just use those. So let's have a look at these in terms of, as a lawyer hat. Within that definition there, a primacy is given to a curved cornea as a cause of myopia. Do we really want to live with that kind of emphasis for the next 20 years? I'm not quite sure about that. They mention the eye being too long, but there's no mention of any other refractive component of the eye like a lens. So through Surge, we've been in contact with the people involved with the ICD-11. There is a review process in place. And in terms of consensus, we're trying to keep the framework of our definition and just nudge it in a direction that is more consistent with how we think about myopia as a growth disorder. Emphasizing the length and also allowing the other optical factors to be in there. So that's been submitted, and we're hoping to see that actually will be included in ICD-11. Now going on to the WHO report. So just it's a very short definition, and some of the words in there, cervical equivalent. There are lots of reasons why the least myopic meridian might be more appropriate, but this is one where there's very strong consensus. So that is certainly one to keep. The question of objective refraction, you might think, well, that's absolutely sort of sensible thing to have in there within a definition. But if you look at, this is a table from a review of incidents on a global basis. And if you add up and that column there shows method of refraction. So if you see how many subjective versus objective there, will in the future all the studies that have a subjective refraction not be included within analysis? Is someone who's prescribed glasses on the standard of basic standard of clinical care not be a myope? So a single word can just twist a definition in a way that actually becomes problematic later on. And another word in there is in either eye. So someone who's -5 in one eye and +4 in the other would, under this definition, be a myope. So it really needs to be an either eye situation. And lastly, in relation to the threshold, -0.5, commonly used. The question is that valid? Now, a subtle point, but one that becomes really important when we're actually using this as a therapeutic area, is this concept of classification bias. Now, classification bias sounds like I'm not quite sure what that means, but if you just turn it into a question, it makes much more sense. So the question is when is a myope not a myope? So this graph here is a colored up version of the Gutenberg eye study from Europe. And all the ones in green are sort of emmetropes and hyperopes. The two color ones there, the yellow one and the orange one, the yellow ones will be included with the -0.5. And dependent on the technique and the biology, there's a strong risk that those might be, really, some of those should be in this group and some of them may be in the myopes. All the reds, they're definitely myopes. But the problem is, because of this distribution curve, where that threshold lies has a huge impact because there's the two largest groups right next to that threshold. Does that matter in practice? Short answer, it matters enormously when you're reporting figures on epidemiology. Because of the shape of that graph curve, if this is Jugni Rahi, one of our committee members, analyzed the study that she'd worked on for a long time, the 1958 birth cohort, and showed that changing the threshold by quarters of a diopters had this impact on the reported prevalence of myopia. So you're going from 20% at -1 to 47%. And those extra 19% in this group actually existed between 0.5 and 1. So optically, a very small impact of myopia. In terms of any myopia, you can see, again, a big area there. The other issue about classification bias is that it can create false positives, you can lose an effect you're looking for, as well as gain spurious ones. So in this study, as if the threshold came down to minus 0.5, so at minus 1 was a strong association with education association. But if you bring it down to minus 0.5, we're bringing in those borderline myopes, you might call it, actually that statistical association was suddenly lost. In relation to efficacy studies, there's also potential. So the outdoor study, in terms of the threshold there, this was the change, the percentage difference in terms of myopia onset. So again, quite small quarter-diopter differences have a huge impact. In relation to the choice of threshold, what we did was we took two large meta-analyses of epidemiology and intervention studies and looked at what thresholds were used to see is there a consensus around that. And the threshold here, that was a bit small, but this is the less than or equal to minus 0.5 in the epidemiology studies, and this is the intervention. So there is absolute consensus around that, even though there are flawed questions about that issue. So what we're proposing to do is to modify that definition so that we have it as an eye-by-eye basis. We bring in the definition from the WHO ICD classification, so requiring accommodation to be relaxed, and that can be by cycloplegia or clinical technique, but it becomes measurement independent. And another really important thing of this is that where risk of bias exists, sensitivity analysis need to be done, much as that previous slide, to indicate how much of this effect is just a borderline effect and how robust it is. Another concept which is in this paper is it's a word that's been out there and been used, but it's the concept of presbyopia. But unless we have an accepted classification of something called presbyopia, it'd be very hard to justify any interventions, particularly drug interventions, that will aim to design to prevent myopia. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, and this classification here ends up being a little bit vaguer than it started off, but the point here is that eyes close to emmetropia in children with baseline refraction, age, and other quantifiable risk factors. Now, at present, our predictive models are not very good, but in time, I'm sure they will improve. And two key factors we haven't really incorporated yet are genetic risk factors and also the measuring and monitoring axial growth, so acceleration of eye growth prior to onset. And the best data from the CLEAR study would suggest that at 6 plus 0.75, but the problem is that threshold changes with the age of the child, and also they're only American children. So the decimation of presbyopia, the risk model has to be appropriate for the population, so it's not appropriate to have it in the definition itself. There are several other definitions which fall into either descriptive brackets or the quantitative brackets, and that previous table with all those descriptive terms, trying to reduce it down to these simple sets of categories, and the full justification and description of those are in the paper itself. The last few minutes we're talking about high myopia. Now, this is an area where it's very easy to find all sorts of this logical definition, confusion between high myopia as an amount, or whether it's high myopia is where you get all the complications of myopia. And dare I point out that this confusion is beautifully emphasized by an alternative eye organization in North America, where this confusion is set out. So what we're strongly pushing for is the fact that high myopia is a concept, is a quantitative concept, just needs a threshold. And in relation to the what you might call pathological myopia, or pathologic, as we're going to be calling it, that requires a set of structural definitions which are entirely independent from refraction, which at first instance sounds a bit odd, but actually does make sense when you go through the details of it. So in relation to the choice, the WHO definition in the report I mentioned earlier on had minus 0.5 in either eye. In terms of the context for this, the justification was that if you have uncorrected minus 5 diopters, which in the third world setting is a very common thing to be uncorrected, you will actually meet the WH threshold for blindness, obviously for distance. But going back to that consensus thing, where does that consensus lie, both in terms of intervention studies and epidemiology studies? This is the 5 threshold. This is either less than 6 or less than equal to 6. And here's the upper end of the threshold in intervention studies, so which is what researchers are calling the top end of normal myopia. So there's a strong justification actually for the -6. So that keeping in concept with the other definitions, this would be the one for the high myopia, and between those two, the -0.5 to the 6 is what we call low myopia, which in more common parlance might be called normal myopia. Now, the terminology of high myopia is frankly a bit of a mess right now. The ICD classification of 11 use this term degenerative high myopia, which has a rather nice 19th century ring to it. And the synonyms also included degenerative, malignant, progressive, and pernicious, my favorite sort of odd term for myopia. Pernicious myope, doesn't that have a good ring to it? Now, words do exist to frame this. So within that whole list, what was missing was the word pathologic or pathological. And the Meta-PM, which was a very large group, came together to bring a photographic classification for that and had a consensus agreement towards pathologic myopia. Unfortunately, they didn't define it. They had a whole series of classifying its subtypes. And this is the definition that, working with some of the key figures from that, we've used. This becomes very complicated, and it is in the papers, but it turns out that for different reasons you need different forms of definitions. And this last one here seems odd, presumed myopic macular degeneration. This is a very simple one, which is designed for a RAB survey. It's a rapid assessment of avoidable blindness, going up all the way up to detailed grading, which will be required for clinical studies. And there are 2 new conditions in this, which have emerged through discussion with retinal specialists, which aren't included within any of these categories, which is this concept of macular traction maculopathy and myopia-associated glaucoma-like optic neuropathy. Now, they're emerging concepts, but there's a very strong evidence base for why those terms should be adopted. So the complete report is due for release in 2019, and these are the aims: to simplify and reduce all the terms down to a small number, have a consensus-based definitions, make sure the definitions are relevant, and in relation to thresholds, sensitivity analysis and reporting, I think, is absolutely critical. And we're trying to build on all the consensus to build as much as an agreement as we can around it. And of course, white matters. In 2000, there were 1.4 billion myopes. In 2015, there might be 4 billion, but that depends on the definition. And for all that the poor little emmetrope in 2050, we need to look out for him as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Our next talk will be presented by Christine Wilderstedt. She comes to us from UC Berkeley, and she will be talking about interventions for myopia. Chris?
Thank you. So I have a list of the contributors to this paper. I won't go through them in the interest of time, but it's my public opportunity to thank everybody for their contributions, which were enormous. So this talk today follows the white paper structure. So I will divide it up into optical, pharmacological, environmental, and surgical interventions. And also, to be sure that you get the take-home messages, I thought I would put them up front. So the paper really, I hope, when it comes out, will convince you that there are evidence-based options for reducing both incident myopia and slowing myopia progression. But there are variations in efficacy, both between options and between individual patients treated with the same options. There is certainly argument for combining different treatments from different treatment groups, at least based on assumed mechanisms at this stage. But there's also very good evidence from the data that we collected for more consistent, comprehensive, objective monitoring to better understand why there is such individual subject differences in efficacy, understanding more about the mechanisms for the options that we currently have, potentially can improve the management strategies. And I think there is plenty of room for moving forward with novel treatment options that are just not on the table right now. So looking at optical control of myopia, and most certainly I'm only going to give you a little taste of what's in the white papers. I can't possibly comprehensively cover what is in them. So the broad categories that we considered were spectacles, multifocal soft contact lenses, and orthokeratology. In terms of the spectacles, that falls under three broad categories: under correction with spectacles, where there's really a lot of conflicting results out there. Peripheral defocus spectacles, which haven't proved as good as we all hoped for, based particularly on the animal work, and multifocal spectacles, where there again is variable results. So in terms of the multifocal spectacles, the executive bifocal study that was done by Cheng et al. is certainly by far the study to give the most promising results. And again, it's interesting to speculate why it did so much better than the Pell study, for example, from Comet. But you can see here, both for bifocals with and without prism, the refractive change was much less than for the single vision control. And when we look at myopia progression in terms of diopters or axial elongation, you see again that difference. So something about those high-set executive bifocals with or without prism certainly made a difference. There is also very interesting data and very conflicting data in terms of whether undercorrection should work, which based on animal studies, we certainly would think it should work. And mostly the studies have been a dismal failure, in fact worse than that. Undercorrection seemed to actually make myopia progress faster, with the exception of a very recent study that actually compared full correction versus progression in kids that had not been corrected at all. It's not a randomized study, but in fact, you could argue that these are somewhat similar studies, but the results are the reverse. So why is that? This is one of the questions where it really points to me that we're not collecting enough data about the subjects in some of these studies to try and understand what's going on. In terms of contact lenses, soft contact lenses, certainly in multifocal form, have shown very promising results, variable across studies. Orthokeratology, absolutely also good outcomes. Rigid gas permeable contact lenses, which in the older literature there was some suggestion that they controlled myopia. When the data was collected in a systematic way, certainly did not provide the evidence for them controlling myopia. So this is a summary of the bifocal soft contact lens studies, multifocal, percentage slowing, and you can see there is variability both for refractive area and axial length between the studies. The greatest effect came from this study on the right, but I'm also going to add an overlay here, which is the individual data from that study on the right. And I think one of the messages for those of you moving into myopia control as clinicians, and I urge you all to consider that based just on the data that Ian presented about the climbing statistics for myopia, but you can see that there are dramatic differences between individual subjects. Some subjects do really well in this study, and other subjects did really poorly, whether you're looking at refraction or axial length. This is something also we need to figure out what's going on. Orthokeratology, again, we see good results, but we also see variability between subjects. So this is a summary of data that was recently published by Pauline Coe and her colleagues. And this is actually showing for the control subjects, which are the dotted lines, and the orthokeratology subjects from 2 different studies. This is the cumulative percentage of subjects showing axial elongation. And so if you're on the left-hand side, this means you're slower progression. And so you can see the ortho-K subjects are doing well. But there's variability in terms of how well individual subjects are doing. In terms of pharmacology, we have atropine, which is sort of the hot topic right now. Pirenzepine trials, not commercially available. Timolol trialed a long time ago, a dismal failure. And oral 7-methylxanthine, or 7-MX, which hasn't really made it out of Denmark at this stage. So in terms of atropine, most of you probably in this room are familiar with this graph, which shows you the refractive changes for a range of different doses and the placebo control. And you can see for the highest concentration, good control, and then it drops off. But even the lowest concentrations seem to actually have control over refraction. And when the subjects were taken off their treatment, the highest concentration caused a rebound effect. But if we look at the axial length data that goes with that study, in fact, there's a concern, significant concern, in that the placebo and the 0.01% actually don't seem to be separated, whereas the 1% certainly dramatically slowed elongation. What's going on here? Now, admittedly, there were different ultrasound versus non-contact axial length measurements made across these studies. Importantly, there certainly seems to be a dose effect which we can work with. This is, again, very recent data published by Yam et al. That shows if we increase the concentration, so now we have everything uniform in terms of how measurements were made, and this, if we just concentrate on the axial length data, we see as we go from placebo to increasing concentration, we are getting progressively less elongation. So we can certainly significantly slow axial elongation. And as we change the doses, we also change the proportion of subjects that are progressing less or more. So a very positive outcome. And also very recently, a study showing that we can combine orthokeratology and low-dose atropine to improve the effect. So more slowing in the combination effect. How is it working? Is atropine just merely opening up the pupil to get a better treatment effect? This is something that's most certainly worth pursuing. Timolol, I said, was a dismal failure. No need to try and convince you here that these 2 bars are no different. There's this change in refraction, even though it lowered intraocular pressure. Why? One of the problems with timolol is it doesn't lower intraocular pressure at night. Is that the reason? It certainly is within the possibilities. 7-MX is an adenosine antagonist. This is early data from Klaus Trier in Denmark, showing an effect on axial elongation. Interestingly, it's an oral medication, which you can argue plus and minus, variability depending on compliance. This data is still largely limited to Denmark. They're accumulating more data. No side effects apparently appearing, no rebound effects, but this is largely direct report. So we need more data in a published form on this medication. Environment, lots of interest in environment, although we have no real understanding of why outdoors can be protective. Lots of speculation from bright light, altered visual environment, vitamin D, but there's certainly something about outdoors. And I think one of the most impressive studies, for me at least, is this randomized control study, which was done in Taiwan, where they, in the controls Schools, kids were allowed to do their normal behavior, but in the treatment schools, the kids were forced to stay outside during the breaks. And importantly, the breaks literally amount to 40 minutes of time outdoors, but it dramatically changed the amount of new myopia that was actually occurring in this population and had slight effect on also progression, but not as much. So there's a more recent study, follow-up study. The results are fairly small, but if you're going to consider combined treatments, I think this is a space certainly that needs to be explored more. Surgical is the last topic, and probably for many of you a somewhat unfamiliar topic unless you've been dealing with very high myopes, because the treatments are largely directed at pathological myopia. The two treatments that have been used significantly clinically include the first two, posterior scleral reinforcement and an injectable system, although the injectable scleral strengthening is limited to Russia. And the last one is really something that is based in animal work at this stage, but there are rumors that clinical trials will be starting. So this is a study done in California where buckling was used as a treatment for pathological myopia, where the eye was continuing to elongate and the retina was starting to literally fall apart in these patients. And you can certainly see in the buckled eyes that the eye seems to have stabilized in its length. The fellow eyes that weren't buckled continued to slowly elongate. In China, that similar procedure has been used in high myopes, and you can also see in this data that there seems to be slowed elongation in the treated group versus the controlled. This surgery is pretty brutal and is not without side effects and requires general anesthesia. There is another version of that also recently published, also out of China, where the donor sclera, which is used in that surgery, was cross-linked with genopin first before insertion. And you can see in the surgical treated eyes, over the monitoring period, there was less elongation than in the fellow eyes of those patients. So right now, as I said, scleral collagen cross-linking, which we will be all familiar with for corneal pathology, whether it be keratoconus or refractive surgery gone wrong, is being trialed in animal studies. There are lots of technical and potential toxicity issues to be dealt with, but I suspect we're going to see some reports in that area very soon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our next paper will be on clinical trials and instrumentation, and it will be presented by James Wolfson from Aston University. In addition to heading up this writing committee, James has done the lion's share of coordinating between all 7 writing groups and has headed up the harmonization component as well. He's really done a lot of work to move all of these forward, and so we owe a great deal of credit for the success of this program really goes to James. But now he's going to talk about the paper that he's been actively involved in. James, please.
Thank you, Earl. So my committee looked at clinical trials and instrumentation, which is important not just for researchers. Hopefully it brings together the literature and the consensus thinking on how you might set up a clinical trial, but just important is for clinicians in terms of reading the literature and understanding clinical trials and their strengths and their weaknesses. So hopefully we've put that together for you, and over the next few minutes I'll explain how we structured that. So in terms of the report and how we split things, it was roughly into two main areas. One being the area of study design and the various aspects of that, and we'll take you through that. And the other was in terms of clinical trial outcomes, and particularly the related instrumentation. As we all know, the field is moving very fast in terms of new instrumentation, and it's very relevant then to the practice of myopia control, and Kate will be talking to you more about that. What instrumentation actually do we need to be using in clinical trials, but then also in practice, if we're going to truly monitor the effect that we're getting and optimizing the treatments that we choose. In terms of the committee, we had 17 members who are listed there from 8 different countries across 5 continents to get a broad consensus of what we should be doing. And then, of course, all of these reports have been harmonized and looked at by all of the committee members, as Earl mentioned, nearly 90 of those, to make sure that this was robust in terms of the advice that it's giving. In terms of selection criteria, we generated tables to look at the selection criteria that have been used in previous studies. And you can see there across a whole range of studies the various criteria they use in terms of what is the baseline refraction, how much astigmatism people should have, best corrected visual acuity, age, those sorts of aspects. So in terms of study design, we looked at the consensus. The recommendation is for at least 3 years of treatment to see the true effect. We know that that treatment effect in many studies slows after the initial period, particularly after that first year. So it's important to understand a 3-year process. We also have seen from previous slides in Chris Wilset's talk that we can get rebound effects with some of the treatments. So again, there's a recommendation that there should be a 1-year follow-up, having removed the treatment, to see what happens in terms of any rebound effect. In terms of controls, it's important that they are simultaneous to make sure that you get away from factors such as seasonal effects, participant age effects. Of course, the younger you are, generally the more your myopia is progressing, and also reduced effects with time. Now, in terms of things like pharmaceuticals, obviously we would generally have a vehicle as a control. It's more difficult when we come to optical methods because many of our single vision optics, such as contact lenses or single vision spectacles, will create aberrations, particularly in the periphery, and depending on how we may understand the mechanism of the myopia elongation, actually they could be having their own effect. And some aspects are relatively difficult to mask. Thinking about here orthokeratology or a bifocal spectacle lens, again that creates some challenges in terms of your controls. So in terms of the selection criteria that are recommended, in terms of refraction, we're looking at a cycloplegic refraction of spherical equivalent refractive error, astigmatism less than 1 diopter, anisometropia less than 1.5 diopters, age generally in that 6 to 12 year age band with a minimum visual acuity of 20/20. And you can see there some exclusion criteria as well in terms of previous RGP wear or previous myopia control treatment or an unhealthy eye, all of which could confound your study. We've talked a little bit about the appropriate control group. Ideally, it would be fully masked. And in terms of our randomization, we might not just want to randomize between our control group and our treatment group, but we may also want to stratify just for the main factors such as age, race, and ethnicity. Again, in terms of study design, when you look at what the controls are, randomization, stratification, and masking, we can build up a picture of what's happened in the previous studies, which has helped to inform those recommendations. And then finally, we need some safety aspects as well. Traditionally, of course, we think about ocular health, and we can do that through a number of ways. Obviously, in terms of anterior eye health, if we're applying some kind of pharmaceutical or optical treatment, but also checking the retina. Standardized adverse event reporting, of course, very important for any study, and binocular vision aspects, and that comes into some of the treatment effects that we've seen as well, visual acuity, and things like light scatter from some of our more complex optical treatments. Treatment effect is quite controversial. Do we say that we want to have a certain treatment effect, like 30%, 50%? Actually, what should it be? And it's really difficult to set that number because it really is quite arbitrary. So instead of trying to set a number, instead we suggested some of the features where you might want the treatment effect to be higher, particularly if you have a treatment which has side effects. You would obviously want risk-benefit, that to give you a better treatment effect. Those that have a shorter duration, because again, we know that the effect tends to decrease with time. But there are other factors that actually we might accept a lower treatment effect. Actually, if the treatment doesn't have any risks, then actually we can still apply that if it has less of an effect. If we're going to do a longer duration study, if patients are younger at the start. So again, this needs to be evaluated on a study-by-study basis rather than trying to set an arbitrary number. In terms of sample size, many of the studies that we see are to do with regulatory approval, and regulatory approval then sets certain limits on the number of subjects, minimum number of subjects that you need. But also we can do sample size analysis on our studies, which generally shows we need many less subjects to show an effect. But it also highlights some areas where we don't have good repeatability data, for example, so it's actually difficult to estimate the effect of noise on the data that we're getting. So hopefully with time we will get better data that will inform studies, particularly those that aren't under regulatory restrictions. In terms of our study outcome measures, then really we can split them into three different groups. Our primary outcome measures, our secondary outcome measures, and then those that are more exploratory in terms of perhaps trying to better understand the mechanism of action of the treatment that we're using. When it comes to primary, as one would expect, refractive error is what we're trying to achieve and therefore an obvious effect. Of course, particularly when we're dealing with young children, we need to do that under cycloplegia. And there was quite a lot of debate about whether we could get away with tropicamide 1%, which would have less effect and a less lasting effect than things like cycloplegia. But particularly if you're then going to go on and do, for example, a pharmaceutical trial, then actually the fact that you're going to be putting a treatment agent in that will affect refractive error in those that can accommodate also needs to be taken into account. So generally for optical type treatments, tropicamide seems to be sufficient from the literature, although there's some people that feel in the Asian eye that may not be enough. But certainly in pharmaceutical trials, then you do need to make sure that you have maximized your cycloplegia. In terms of subjective or autorefraction is generally preferred because of its objective nature, and also it is a much more repeatable technique. But remember, with refractive error, of course, with a treatment such as Ortho-K, you're going to change that through the treatment, and you're not going to then remove that to test it, and therefore you do need a different primary outcome measure. The other one, and of course a very preferred one, is axial length, although that's difficult to measure outside clinical trials because of the expense of equipment. But axial length is very much associated with the risk of myopia in terms of our understanding. Generally, we've moved from ultrasound, which had a relatively low resolution of about a third of a diopter, to partial coherence interferometry or OCT type measurements, where we can now get a resolution down to 0.03 of a diopter. So again, a very important metric in clinical trials, and has been identified again by Chris Wilsett in her presentation. Some treatments we see a very different effect in terms of what we see from refractive error compared to what we see for axial length. When it comes to our secondary measures, we're looking at things like patient-reported outcomes, both from the patient themselves, but also the parent and guardian experience. But we do know from things like meta-analyses that parents that have the condition tend to underestimate the effect that it's having on their child, and so there can be some natural biases from both of those groups. The patient themselves, being younger again, may not give you the full effect that they're experiencing. And also when we're looking at secondary measures, compliance is really important, as it is with any treatment. So how do we do that better? Can we remind our patients, particularly with digital technology, to use their correction or treatment? Maybe we can make it more exciting through things like gamification, which is coming into a whole load of areas. And of course, we're getting much better wearable sensors now that can detect the condition, environmental conditions, but also in terms of whether a treatment is being used at the intervals that it's been prescribed. In terms then of the exploratory measures, there are a whole load of those, from peripheral refraction, accommodative changes, ocular alignment, pupil size, outdoor activity, anterior and posterior segment changes, and tissue biomechanics. And of course, which ones of those you choose will be relevant to the type of intervention, and there's some tables in the report suggesting those that may help you better understand the mechanism of your particular type of treatment. But if we look at those in a bit more detail, peripheral refraction, of course, has been a lot of interest in, based on the animal studies that suggest that this is a driving force for myopia control. It is difficult to measure, and depending on the instrumentation you use, whether that is something like autorefraction or aberrometry, can cause some effects and distortions in your data that it is important to understand. In terms of the angles that we typically look at, it's towards the 10 to 40 degrees. As I've said, there are a variety of techniques. Better to use more objective techniques such as autorefraction and aberrometry compared to subjective and retinoscopy, which are difficult to achieve while someone is looking eccentrically. Also, we have accommodative changes. Of course, they've long been thought to cause myopia, but even if they are not linked, many of our treatment effects can affect accommodation. Generally, we look at aspects such as lag, subjectively, objectively, and with aberrations. We need an appropriate target to drive our accommodation as well. We can also nowadays look at the dynamics. Unfortunately, the video is not working there, but we can look at the dynamics of accommodation to see that that hasn't been impacted in terms of the person and their environment. Ocular alignment is another important area in terms of things like esophoria, and we know that that can be linked with the effect, the treatment effect that we seem to get with some of our treatments, particularly our optical treatments, but there's been no shown link with orthokeratology or pharmaceuticals. And then pupil size, of course, again, will have an effect, and particularly with some of our optical corrections, pupil size is quite important in terms of how much of a treatment effect there is in terms of the zones of the periphery that actually will have light through them and exposed to the retina. However, our pupil size is dynamic, so how can we report that in a form that will be relevant to the study? So perhaps we need to take it under different illumination conditions or some of the dynamic aspects as well. In terms of outdoor activity, as has been mentioned previously, a lot of interest in this aspect of clinical trials. We need better ways of monitoring that, and we're getting much better ways of doing that with some of the wearable sensors. Again, generally we have to make assumptions in terms of a cutoff to say, well, actually this is outdoor activity when lighting is above a particular level. And we now have some new sensors coming onto the market where we can monitor working distance as well as lighting levels. In terms then of anterior and posterior segment changes, again, we can do that with a number of different techniques, such as photography, OCT, and also some of our imaging techniques, such as shine plug, both as a safety mechanism, but also we can have a look at how our treatment is interacting with the ocular surface, for example. And we know that there are some natural effects in terms of myopes having a different anterior segment and some posterior changes compared to our other groups as well. And also we're looking for things like toxicity effects when it comes to our pharmaceuticals. In terms of tissue biomechanics, which is our last exploratory measure, we can look at that both of the sclera and cornea, and particularly we don't know whether it's a precursor to myopia development or a consequence. A number of different ways have been applied in the literature to take these sorts of measures. Generally they are quite exploratory in design, and Chris again talked about corneal cross-linking being potentially tested, and of course that would be an important thing to look at in terms of our biomechanics. So therefore there's a sort of minimum data set that we can think about for each of our different trials to make sure that we understand both the efficacy of the treatment but also its safety and its applicability, and perhaps also better understand its mechanism of action. So in conclusion then, of course, clinical trials need to be robustly set up in terms of declaration of Helsinki, ethical opinion, informed consent of your patients, adverse event reporting and clinical trial registration, that minimum of 3 years to see the treatment effect with a 1-year follow-up, inclusion and exclusion criteria as I outlined earlier, randomization both in terms of your control and your treatment, but also some stratification within that. Our primary outcome measures of axial length and refractive error, but also then secondary measures and exploratory measures. And then finally things like using the same instrumentation throughout the trial, making sure it's calibrated and validated, and procedures very carefully recorded, not just in terms of doing the trial, but also then in the papers to allow people to scrutinize those and to replicate and benchmark as necessary. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, James. Our next talk will be on clinical management guidelines. It'll be presented by Kate Gifford from the Queensland University of Technology. Kate, please.
Thanks, Earl. I'll just check I'm on. I'm going to stand up from beside the podium, otherwise you won't be able to see me. I'll just be a talking head. So clinical management guidelines are extremely important in being able to put all of this vast amount of research into practice. And in going through this process, it's been a rigorous and an enriching experience. And first of all, I couldn't have done it without my team. So this is the committee, which is a combination of clinicians, scientists, and academics from right around the world. I have to give special acknowledgement to the two first colleagues there, Catherine Richdale and Pauline Kang, who did an enormous amount of work alongside me in smoothing the work of 15 people into one voice and also addressing comments from 25 different reviewers. Also on that slide, I should also mention the work of Padmaja Sankari-Durg, who was the harmoniser. Now this is a little teaser of what was included in the Clinical Management Guidelines report. Now I want to give you a bit of anticipation of what's ahead, but also give you some things that you can take back into clinical practice. So I'll address each of these in turn. Identifying the myopia management patient is key, and that is understanding risk factors such as age, family history, ethnicity, visual environment, and binocular vision. Ian talked earlier about the pre-myope and how important it is to understand that as a separate condition in terms of interventions and also in terms of clinical identification. So it's very clear from these reports that we now have a definition of pre-myopia and that we have some idea of interventions that can be offered, both from a clinical perspective and also from a research perspective into the future. Discussing myopia, translating this information into parent and patient-facing language is a significant challenge, And so there is an emphasis on this paper in being able to describe these aspects. So this is information that, as a clinician, you might want to include in informed consent reports, or to think about how you're actually putting this information forward. And in this second section, it includes lay discussion of causes, understanding the basis of myopia, and lay discussion of the eye health risk. So we can explain to the parent the why of myopia and why we need to intervene beyond just refractive correction. This is continued in the third section, which is discussing with parents and patients myopia control treatments. This is understanding the risks, the options, and these options aren't actually discussing the specific efficacy of each. There's a whole paper just for that, as Chris Waldsepp was telling us earlier. It's more discussing the options in terms of safety, efficacy, understanding the need for additional corrections, the understanding of safety, how to minimise risk, and most importantly, informed consent and prescribing off-label treatments. Now, prescribing off-label treatments has different implications in clinical practice across the world. So this is addressed in the report. There are some places in the world where this is of minimal concern and it requires less discussion with parents than what it does in other parts of the world. But regardless of the regulatory requirements, it's an important consideration in putting this research into practice. Now, the fourth part of the report details the key elements of the baseline examination for myopia control. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in these in just a moment. There's a standard procedure, and then we also explored binocular vision evaluation, dry eye evaluation, which is important if we're thinking about fitting contact lenses. As we know, contact lenses are a key armament in the myopia control treatment strategy, and also exploratory tests. Taking these things that James Wilson was talking about, these clinical trial tests, and putting a little bit of a future focus on what we might be looking at in clinical practice in the time to come. So just to explore that a little bit further, the key elements of the baseline examination for myopia control include certain clinical tests which should occur at all visits, and then some tests which occur specific to the type of treatment. Now, something which was very interesting in the process of writing this report and also in the process of review was discussion of cycloplegic refraction and axial length measurement. Now, if we think about it from a clinical trial or a research point of view, there's no doubt that we need axial length measurement and that we need ideally cycloplegic refractions and ideally objective refractions. However, when it comes to cycloplegic refraction, this might not be feasible in certain countries or it might not be appropriate to the patient. And in Ian Flitcroft's definitions report earlier, it's important to note that the definition of myopia was when ocular accommodation is controlled. So there's various ways to control ocular accommodation, but this definition means that it lends itself to both cycloplegic and typical clinical subjective techniques as well. Now, when it comes to axial length, there's no doubt that if as clinicians we're looking at a myopia control study, we need to have axial length data to make a judgment of what the efficacy is. But do we need to do it in practice? Now, the answer is yes, ultimately, but the answer at this point is maybe not. And that's simply because there's no established criteria yet to enable us to determine what's normal amount of axial elongation or what's excessive axial elongation in the individual. So it makes it a little bit of a complex diagnostic factor for clinical myopia management. But it is an extremely useful factor in terms of disease risk. And so if we have a child whose axial length is approaching 26 millimetres, which appears to be the cutoff for where this risk really starts to ramp up, then that may modify our treatment strategy. Now, when it comes to exploratory tests, these are things we're learning about in the literature, things where, as James was telling us earlier, there's some evidence and some conjecture as to how these could influence myopia development and progression. So, in future, we could be measuring relative peripheral refraction, higher order aberrations. We could be understanding how pupil size might influence efficacy in different treatments. We might be measuring subfoveal choroidal thickness response as an indication to which treatment could work for an individual. And we might be using wearable devices to track visual environment and working distance and other elements that are indicated in environmental development of myopia. Now, selecting a treatment strategy. It's important to note here that this is not about which has the best efficacy, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole separate paper on that. Predicting a progression rate and selecting a treatment is based on factors such as the baseline prescription, safety concerns, cost and compliance concerns, and this is detailed in the paper. Add powers in multifocal soft lenses are an interesting area of research and of the cutting edge of clinical practice. This is addressed. And clinical spectacle myopia control is also addressed because we're pretty much always going to start with that. There might be children who aren't yet ready for contact lenses or will never be ready for contact lenses. Or if atropine treatments are being used, then perhaps spectacles are more attractive. So it's important for us to understand those options both now and what's also on the horizon. Guidelines for advice in clinical care is perhaps the meatiest part of the paper, so I want to go into a little bit more detail on that. Now this includes such detail as refractive correction and wearing time. What do we need to advise in terms of compliance to actually get efficacy from these treatments? Indoor work and near work activity, outdoor activity and lighting. What is the advice that we should be giving to parents and patients? Nutritional advice, in that we don't really have specific nutritional advice at this point, but as Chris was mentioned earlier, there are nutritional and different sort of metabolites which could be used in future for management. Advice to patients and parents on minimising risk with contact lens wear and atropine is included. Backup corrections for contact lens wear are an important consideration when we're thinking about what type of contact lens we're wearing and how that visual system is adapted. And the review schedule and clinical considerations are also important. Now, review schedules here will vary depending on the type of treatment, but obviously the idea here is to be as rigorous as possible to make sure that we're achieving safety as well as achieving efficacy. Now, this section continues with information on treatment duration, when to change treatment, what possibly indicates we're not achieving what we want to, long-term efficacy and rebound effects, which is an absolutely important point from a research perspective, as James was telling us, but also in terms of providing clinical advice. And also when to end treatment. There's unfortunately a scarcity of data in when myopia stops progressing. We don't have a lot of our data on young adult myopia progression. So this is an interesting area for further research, but also requires awareness for the clinician. And this section also includes some detail on late onset myopia and high myopia, special considerations we need for managing that pathological side of things, as Ian was talking about at the outset. Now, the future research directions on intervention and treatment include some discussion on ortho-K and multifocal soft lens optimization. This is a hot topic in research and also, as I mentioned earlier, the cutting edge of clinical practice. And also things that we might be using in future. 7-MX is this metabolite of caffeine, which Christine mentioned earlier, that's being trialled in Denmark. Is this something which will become more widespread? Scleral reinforcement was also mentioned, and it surely does make the risks of contact lens infection seem pretty small by comparison when we're thinking about treatments for children, but this is being trialled in Russia. Understanding how circadian rhythms and sleep could influence our advice to parents and patients is important. There was a study from Korea that showed reducing amounts of sleep meant increasing levels of myopia. And there's other elements of research when we put our clinical eyes on that might give us indication of things we could be doing in future. Now, the final section includes clinical references, education and communication. And this includes detail on key papers, website and courses for practitioner reference, recommendations for communication tools to be able to tell this story to parents and patients, and continuing education and accreditation of practitioners. And if you sign up now and get the steak knives, you'll also get the bonus supplementary digital content. So this includes additional detail, the sort of things which are likely to change in the near future, including these key reference papers, which you need to read yourselves, and you may also supply to the academically minded parent. Online practitioner and education resources, online forums that are available, clinical conferences which are increasingly including a focus on myopia control, resources available for communication to the parent and the patient, software tools that are available to you, and also an example-informed consent form. And this is very important stuff for us to understand, to lay the groundwork for us to be able to confidently explain this to parents and patients. Now, when we started this process over a year ago, I had this idea of the clinical management guidelines being these wonderful flowcharts and patient-specific nomograms. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you it isn't that. At the plenary session on Wednesday, I heard a fantastic quote that stuck with me, that evidence doesn't dictate prescribing decisions. Evidence doesn't tell us precisely what to do in the clinical situation with that patient. We need the evidence as the foundation. Then we have to make that decision ourselves and put all of these other patient-specific considerations into the mix. So it isn't an enormous flowchart, which is what you're hoping for. When I was Googling enormous flowchart in setting up this presentation, this is actually a procrastination flowchart. We don't want you to procrastinate with loads of flowcharts, although they're pretty. What this is, though, is this is a clear line in the sand. This is a clear foundation that says that it's no longer acceptable to just prescribe single vision corrections to progressing myopes. That we need to do something more. We need to start with these conversations and consider these interventions. Now, because it doesn't provide all of that information in translating it into practice, there's still going to be some work to do in bringing this to life. And in being a clinician, first and foremost, and wanting to see other clinicians take this into practice, all of these reports are essential reading. But the particular reports of essential reading are understanding, defining and classifying myopia, the interventions for myopia control, and also the industry guidelines and ethical considerations report, which hasn't been discussed today. This talks about the responsibilities of industry, of practitioners, of how we communicate these things to parents and patients, particularly in views of these regulatory concerns and off-label treatments. And in terms of peer discussion, I've been running a Facebook group called Myopia Profile for around 2 years now. And when the reports were submitted, I put a little joyous post up because it's been taken about a year of work to get there, which explained a little bit more detail about the clinical guidelines. So this is a group which is just for clinicians and students and for industry, and this is where there's going to be a lot more discussion of these reports and how these actually come to life in a clinical setting. As Earl mentioned at the outset, the International Myopia Institute is free to join, so head over to the website and sign up to get updates on this important area, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kate. Our final presentation will be given by David Troilo from the College of Optometry at the State University of New York, and he'll be talking about experimental models of emmetropization and myopia. David?
Okay, am I on? Thank you, Earl. Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do is sort of give you an overview of this major review paper that we put together looking at experimental models of emmetropization and myopia. And because it's so large, I think the way I'm going to do it is to just try to highlight a few of the major contributions that research with animal models have given us in our understanding of the visual control of eye growth and the development of myopia. Most of these findings have been extrapolated to human, and in a few cases, excuse me, actually form the basis of some of the treatments that we're testing today. Before I get into this, I do have to acknowledge my co-authors. This was a major team effort. Everyone on this list, these are researchers from around the world who are doing different parts of experimental models, and they've all contributed major sections to the paper. The paper is quite an extensive paper. It covers 40 years plus of research in the field. There are more than 800 references cited from peer-reviewed journals. We only use peer-reviewed journals. There are 18 summary figures and 3 major lookup tables that for graduate students and people that are interested in doing a deeper dive, this will be a great reference for you. The general organization of the paper is this. We go into the various types of experimental species that have been used, what the evidence is for visual regulation of eye growth and refractive state, some of the ocular anatomical changes associated with experimentally induced myopia, operating characteristics of visually controlled eye growth, the role of circadian rhythms in eye growth. There's a large section on biochemistry of eye growth, including sections on drug studies in the animal models. And finally, we wrap up with a discussion of the molecular biology, looking at the gene environment interactions in emmetropization and myopia. These are the original 3 animal models for myopia research. These are rhesus macaques, tree shrews, and chicks. The use of these species came out of some research on the development of the visual system, where it was discovered that depriving the eye of form deprivation causes axial elongation and myopia. I'd like to mention that most of the work that's been done with animal models has been done with the chick model, largely because of its ease of, it's readily available, but also there's been some very interesting and creative studies that have been done there that have really revolutionized and changed our view of eye growth control. It's also I just also would like to mention that, you know, the chick model of eye growth has been around for many years, and most of what we know, or very much of what we know about the development of the eye in utero, the embryology of the eye, comes from work on chick. We've also added to this lots of studies using a New World primate. This is the marmoset monkey. We've also been using guinea pigs as a mammalian model that's much more readily available than the tree shrew. In recent years, we've added to our stable of animal models the zebrafish and the mouse, mainly for its use in genetic studies of the mechanisms of myopia. All of these species, the major species that I'll be talking about today, emmetropize naturally. And it was found that if you deprive them of form vision or disrupt that or disrupt vision, you're also going to disrupt emmetropization and produce axial myopia. This was the original finding. It was also shown that when you discontinue that form deprivation, that you will get recovery from that myopia, suggesting that there was actually visual control of eye growth and refractive state. But it wasn't until this paradigm, this lens rearing paradigm, developed originally by Frank Schafel, Adrian Glasser, and Howie Howland, came about that we could say that there was really conclusive evidence that visual control of eye growth exists. In this paradigm, either myopic or hyperopic defocus is imposed on the eye with spectacle or contact lenses, and the eye can grow in such a way that it compensates for that defocus, sort of emmetropizing through the lens. When the lens is removed, the eye is either too long in the case of imposing hyperopic defocus and myopic, or it's shorter than normal and hyperopic in the case of myopic defocus. So this model, this paradigm, has been very, very powerful. It's been used by many different laboratories in a variety of species to study the mechanisms behind this visual control of growth. So this slide from the paper shows the compensation range for imposed defocus for a variety of species used. So you can see that the chick has the widest range of compensation, going somewhere from approximately 10 diopters of hyperopic defocus all the way up to about 20 diopters of myopic defocus. Excuse me, I'm just going to... all of the other species that we've looked at also have a range of compensation. It's not quite as large as the chick, but it's mostly in the range of about 5 to 10 diopters of hyperopic defocus to about 5 to 10 diopters of myopic defocus. Even the mouse, with its small eyes, seems to be able to compensate for approximately 8 to 10 diopters of imposed hyperopic defocus and up to 5 diopters of myopic defocus. Okay, one of the questions that was often asked after these studies showing visual control of eye growth was what happens if you impose simultaneously 2 different types of defocus? So the response to competing visual signals seems to be weighted toward the more positive defocus in a variety of species that have been looked at. Now that's good news for the development of lenses that have positive defocus additions, or positive additions, I should say, on top of the distance correction. Another major finding that came out of the animal research areas is the demonstration that this visual regulation of the eye seems to be localized to the eye itself. And not only is it localized to the eye itself, regions of the eye can regulate its refractive state and growth. So this was originally shown, again, in the chick model by Josh Wallman and co-workers, and in which he found that depriving the eye or regions of the eye of form vision produced localized elongations to those regions that were deprived in myopia that was restricted to that area. This was subsequently shown by Schafel with hemifield defocusing lenses. It's also been shown in mammals and primates, as this slide shows. Now this is what people are talking about when they talk about the effects of peripheral refraction. And the way I see this phenomenon is that it's a demonstration of local control that can be used in the design and development of contact lenses or spectacle lenses that have positive defocus as a feature for myopia control. We know that the larger the area of peripheral retina that you affect with a defocusing lens, the more you can affect the central axial growth and central refraction. There's been a lot of discussion about outdoor activity, and some of the ideas have been that it's light intensity, it's spectral composition of the light. There are other ideas that are important to consider as well. But in animal research, there's been demonstration that light intensity and spectral composition both can affect the growth of the eye and its refractive state. There's a caveat, however, that the way that these things are working on eye growth is very complex, and it interacts with the eye's chromatic aberrations, the spectral sensitivities of the different photoreceptors, the ocular circadian rhythms, and the temporal integrations of visual signals. So there's a lot of research that has yet to be done in this area and needs to be done because it's an interesting topic. The role of the choroid in the control of eye growth was first demonstrated by studies in chick. This has now been shown in every animal model that we've looked at to date, and it's also been shown to occur in humans as well. And the idea is that the choroid thickness can be modulated in response to defocus signals in such a way that it contributes to the compensation for that defocus. We know that it may act, or we think that it may act as an accommodative response that also may modulate eye growth and emmetropization. Now, of course, the final effector organ for changes in eye growth and eye shape is the sclera. And so it's a number of biochemical studies have been done to look at what's changing in the sclera, how scleral growth is affected. Remodeling of the extracellular matrix has been looked at extensively. The biomechanical properties to the sclera are changing when eyes are responding to different kinds of defocus, and that might play a role in the way that the eye responds to things like intraocular pressure. But the question remains how it is that the visual signal on the retina eventually will affect these growth changes in the sclera to alter the eye size, growth rate of the eye, and its refractive state. So this is where the biochemical study of eye growth comes into play or comes into its own. And there's been a tremendous amount of work done in this area. And I'll just summarize it briefly with this schematic here showing what we're calling in the paper the signal cascade of theory of eye growth control. So the idea here is that various changes in the biochemistry of retina in response to the visual signal produces a growth signal. And that growth signal, some things have been implicated here, particularly retinal dopamine and other neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, but there are growth factors such as retinoic acid, glucagon, and insulin that may play a role. Gene expression is changed, and other substances have been identified like nitric oxide and melanopsin. So these things are somehow signaling into the RPE and choroid other changes that will signal into the sclera to remodel the extracellular matrix and induce a growth change. This will then change the shape of the eye, the size of the eye, and its refractive state, which feeds back to the visual signals, again, that the retina is receiving. So this is sort of a way of thinking, a frame of reference of thinking about the kinds of things that a number of people are investigating actively to understand the control of eye growth, and the visual control of eye growth in particular. By the way, these various studies are identifying potential targets for drugs that could work to modify or modulate the growth effects and slow myopia progression. And of course, one of those drugs that we all know is being used is atropine. Now, atropine was, of course, originally used because of its cycloplegic effect, and the idea that reducing accommodation was important for controlling myopia progression. We now know from animal studies, however, that the mechanism does not involve accommodation or the ciliary muscle. In fact, studies are ongoing to look at what the mechanism of atropine is on eye growth, and it could be through both muscarinic and even non-muscarinic pathways. Finally, turn to gene expression. So the molecular biologist is applying tools to study changes in gene expression at every step in the cascade. Changes have been shown in the retina, in the RPE, in the choroid, and the sclera. And these changes in response to retinal defocus are supporting the idea of a signal cascade and identifying important elements in that cascade. In fact, recent studies have shown that the retina responds to imposed hyperopic or myopic defocus through largely different pathways, suggesting that new avenues for drug design and drug development. So in conclusion, our thinking about emmetropization and myopia development has been transformed by experimental studies using animal models. Over more than 40 years, work with these models have made significant, important breakthroughs that help lead to new and effective treatments for myopia control in humans. Experimental models are providing a more complete understanding of the mechanism of eye growth control, making the development of new and even more effective treatments possible. I'd like to also acknowledge a number of individuals who, along the way, as we were developing and working on this paper, provided comments and suggestions that were extremely helpful. I'd also like to thank Monica Zhang for all the work that she did as a taskmaster, keeping us focused and keeping things moving. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Brian Holden Vision Institute and its sponsors for making this white paper project possible. Thank you very much.
Just a reminder before we open the floor to questions, all 7 of these white papers, which will be published early next year, will be available on open access portals from IOVS, but they'll also be available at no cost on the Myopia Institute website, so please take advantage of that. And we now have time for questions. We'd love to address questions, comments, or suggestions that come from the audience. And please take advantage of the microphones that are up at the front of the auditorium, please. So just to restate, the observation was that many of the patients that she has seen are younger than 6 years of age and are very interested in myopia control strategies. And Kate, would you like to address that issue?
So I think the quandary with children younger than these typical studies is a similar quandary we have with children older than these typical studies, because we don't have good data on young adult progression of myopia. And when it comes to treating this group, this younger than 6 years of age, we've got significantly more compliance concerns, we might have safety concerns, their ability to interact with certain treatments, whether that be pharmacological or contact lens or spectacles, can be very complex. So it's the best we can do is to take the available evidence and extrapolate, but we do that all the time. Studies might have been done on Chinese Canadian children or children aged 8 to 12 with a family history of myopia, or whatever the case is. There's always these situations where we have to extrapolate, and that's the best we can do from an evidence-based approach. But it's definitely a more complex group, because the younger they're myopic, the more likely they are to progress. So these are the ones where we want to intervene, but also we've got those other additional concerns about how well they can comply and participate in treatments.
Excellent question. And actually, you know what, we didn't think about that. So the question was, is it an ocular refraction or a refraction in the spectacle plane? So I think the answer is that the standard instrumentation or standard clinical tools will always be measuring it as an ocular refraction rather than what is prescribed. So we are measuring it so objective refractions are measuring the ocular refraction as do clinical techniques. So I think the answer is that we're not using a spectacle correction, but actually the refraction that's measured as an error, not what's prescribed in glasses. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Just to recap, the statement is what's being done in terms of combination therapies, for example, an optical treatment strategy combined with a pharmaceutical treatment strategy. Kate, we'll invite you up to the podium one more time. I should highlight, white papers are not meant to be the end all. These are growing live documents. And we expect your comments and input and help in moving these forward with time.
So because we don't have a clear idea of the different mechanisms that drive myopia development, progression, and control, it makes sense that if things are likely to have different mechanisms, and if we've got a child at significant risk of fast progression, why wouldn't we throw everything at them? So from that basis, it makes sense. We only have very, very early data on combination of atropine and optical treatments. So there have been 2 studies published on atropine and ortho-K treatment, and one is unfortunately a rubbish study that doesn't even mention differences. And then another one is very early. The authors themselves say that this is preliminary data because it was small and it suffered some biases in terms of the different groups. So there is a study going on in Hong Kong at the moment looking at atropine and ortho-K combined, and that could possibly be extrapolated to atropine and multifocal lenses, although we know the optics of atropine and multifocal lenses are different. What's also interesting is thinking about how environmental interventions could interact with optical treatments as well. And so if the future involves children having wearable devices to provide information about light exposure and working distance and that sort of thing, that could interact with different corrections as well. We do understand there has been a paper showing a possible mechanism for how atropine and optical defocus could interact, but that paper looked at 0.3% atropine, which is a lot stronger than what we use in practice. So in conclusion, watch this space.
I learned a new term, rubbish publication. Was that it? I'll remember that. Yes, sir. Okay, the question deals with adenosine receptor antagonist. 7MX is a metabolite of caffeine, and it is used orally, and there was primary interest in that because 7-MX, unlike caffeine, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, and so you don't get the arousal effects with 7-MX. To my knowledge, there have been no human trials on caffeine. We have done a number of studies in non-human primates looking at both 7-MX, 7-MX given systemically, orally, and caffeine given topically, because when you apply caffeine topically, the amount that's absorbed systemically is quite minute, and hopefully the drug is getting to the organ that you want to manipulate in a relatively direct way. We've presented the results here at the Academy last year, and the paper's sort of in preparation, but the gist of it is caffeine, topical caffeine produces the same protective effects against vision-induced myopia that systemic oral 7-MX does. On the other hand, caffeine and oral 7-MX actually augment the hyperopic shifts produced by myopic defocus. So the animal data certainly support the notion that adenosine receptor antagonists may be a viable treatment option for slowing the progression of myopia. There are a tremendous number of questions that we need to answer. We don't really know where this stuff is acting. There are adenosine receptors in cornea, ciliary body, retina, choroid, sclera, everywhere. We're just not sure where this stuff is acting. But it does seem to have, I think you'll see more on adenosine receptor antagonists. The exciting thing that has come out of the animal models is that emotropization cascade that David described, and the key thing is every time you identify a component within that cascade, there's the potential for intervention. And adenosine receptors happens to be one of those. What? Oh, I'm sorry, we have I'm going to be corrected.
No. I'm leaving Earl as king of the animal kingdom and going over to children. There's another adenosine antagonist that doesn't not get mentioned, but it's theobromine, which is from chocolate. And the prospect of actually finding chocolate as a cure for myopia was just too enticing. So we did, in collaboration with two big nutritional surveys, Alspach and the ENSHANES, where there's detailed dietary information and refraction, looking to see whether there's any correlation between chocolate, Coke, caffeine, and refraction outcome. Now, see if there was a smoking gun in the clinical information. Sadly, neither of those actually showed that, but obviously that maybe does affect there. So, but I'm still hoping that chocolate might cure it.
So throw a good cigar in there and you got it made. Other questions? Well, on behalf of the IMI, I really want to thank our panelists. They have done a tremendous amount of work in a relatively short period of time. Some of them have traveled a long way just for this event, but they have really done a tremendous job of putting these white papers together. I encourage you to take advantage of their work. All 7 of those will be available early next year. And thank you for coming, and thank you for your participation.